shy Waitress greeted the vampire, King's Patriarch. Her ancient dialect silenced the court. Keep your eyes on the floor, Cylindra. If you look at them, they take it as an invitation. The innkeeper's gruff whisper vanished under the clatter of tankards, but the warning remained etched in her spine. Cylindra didn't need the reminder. In the borderlands between the human kingdoms and the eternal night, survival meant invisibility. But tonight, the air in the tavern tasted of ozone and iron. The door swung open, not with a creak, but with a silent, terrifying surrender. A man entered, draped in darkness that seemed to breathe, his presence silencing the drunkards instantly. He was beauty carved from glaciers, and he was looking for something he had lost centuries ago. He just didn't expect to find it trembling behind a tray of spilled ale. The rusty flagon was a misnomer. Nothing in the establishment was merely rusty. It was rotting. Located in the armpit of the grey mist valley, it served as the last watering hole for desperate merchants, foolhardy mercenaries, and those unfortunate souls who had nowhere else to go. Cylindra belonged to the latter category. At 22, she was a ghost in a stained apron. Her hair, the colour of wet straw, was always tucked beneath a frayed scarf, and her eyes, a startling, luminous violet, were perpetually fixed on the grime of the floorboards. She moved with the fluid silence of a prey animal, weaving between tables of rowdy patrons who smelled of unwashed wool and fear. "Ale, girl, and make it froth!" a mercenary bellowed, his hand swiping clumsily at her skirt. Cylindra sidestepped him with practiced ease, placing the tankard down without spilling a drop. "At once, sir," she murmured, her voice barely a vibration in the smoky air. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful sound that rattled the shutters. It was the season of the long night, when the sun dipped below the horizon and refused to return for 30 days. It was their season. The heavy oak door of the tavern didn't just open, it was pushed by a force that felt like a physical weight pressing against the chest of everyone in the room. The silence that followed was absolute. It wasn't the quiet of a pause, it was the quiet of a predator entering a pen. 3 figures stepped out of the storm. To the left stood a man of hulking proportions, his skin the colour of polished mahogany, his eyes burning like embers. This was Kenric Everhart, a name whispered in fear by the border guards. To the right was a woman of lethal elegance, her skin pale as milk, her lips stained a cruel red. Veronet. But it was the man in the centre who sucked the oxygen from the room. Isidore Draymore, the Patriarch, the Vampire King. He wore a long coat of black velvet that seemed to absorb the dim lantern light. His hair was a cascade of midnight, tied back with a silver ribbon, revealing a face of such severe, aristocratic angles that it hurt to look at him. He didn't look at the patrons. He looked through them. "Innkeeper!" Kenric's voice boomed, shaking the dust from the rafters. "The High Lord requires shelter. The storm carries the scent of sulphur hounds. We wait it out here." Giles, the innkeeper, looked as though his heart had already stopped. He stammered, turning a shade of grey that rivaled the valley mist. My lords, my lady, we are but a humble—" "Silence!" Veronet hissed, gliding forward. "Clear the centre table, now!" The mercenaries, usually brave with liquid courage, scrambled over each other to vacate the best table near the hearth. In seconds the room was divided, the terrifying trio by the fire, and the humans huddled in the shadows, praying to be ignored. "Cylindra," Giles squeaked, shoving a pitcher of their finest, and only, vintage wine into her hands. "Serve them, don't speak, don't look, just pour." Cylindra's hands trembled. The pitcher felt like lead. She took a breath, trying to steady the frantic rhythm of her heart, and walked toward the fire. As she approached, The heat of the hearth seemed to die, replaced by a glacial chill radiating from Isidore. He was seated, one leg crossed over the other, staring into the flames with an expression of infinite boredom and ancient weariness. Cylindra reached the table. She focused on the grain of the wood, pouring the wine into 3 pewter goblets. Her hand slipped. A single drop of red wine splashed onto the pristine white cuff of Isidore's shirt. The sound of the drop hitting the fabric echoed like a gunshot. Veronet gasped, a sound like a blade being drawn. "You clumsy, filth-ridden cattle!" Before Cylindra could breathe, Veronet's hand lashed out. It was a blur, too fast for human eyes, backhanding Cylindra across the face. The force sent the waitress sprawling onto the floor, the pitcher shattering, wine pooling around her like blood. "I will drain you dry for that insult," Veronet snarled, her fangs descending, her eyes bleeding into total blackness. She lunged. Cylindra didn't think. Instinct, buried deep in her bloodline, older than the tavern, older than the kingdom, surged up. She scrambled backward, raising a hand, and the words tumbled from her lips. Not common, not the trade tongue, but a rhythmic, guttural string of syllables that felt like stones grinding together. Vortalis, Ethelgard, Sumina, Cora. The air in the room solidified. Veronet froze mid-lunge, her body paralyzed not by fear, but by a command woven into the very fabric of her species' existence. Isidore, who had not moved a muscle since entering, slowly turned his head. For the first time he looked at Cylindra. His eyes were not black nor red. They were a piercing, impossible gold, with pupils that were vertical slits. The silence was deafening. The mercenaries held their breath. Giles was praying silently. Isidore stood up. He towered over the room. He walked past the frozen Veronet, his boots crunching on the broken pottery. He stopped inches from where Cylindra lay trembling on the floor. He crouched down, ignoring the wine soaking the hem of his coat. He reached out, a long, pale finger lifting her chin, forcing her to look into the abyss of his gaze. "Say that again," Isidore commanded. His voice was not loud, but it resonated in her bones, a baritone that tasted of dark chocolate and grave dirt. Cylindra shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know what I said. I'm sorry, my lord, I'm sorry." "You spoke the high umbral," Isidore said, his eyes narrowing. "The dialect of the First Court, a language dead for 3,000 years, a language that commands the blood." He tilted his head, studying her face, looking past the grime and the fear. "Who are you, little mouse?" "Cylindra," she whispered. "Just Cylindra." Isidore stood, pulling a handkerchief from his pocket. Ironically, the very one he should have used to wipe his cuff, and dropped it onto her lap. "Kenrick," Isidore said, turning his back on her. "Yes, Patriarch? Pay the innkeeper for the damage, and for the girl." Cylindra's heart stopped. "Pay?" Isidore glanced back over his shoulder, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. Terrifying and beautiful. "You just commanded a vampiress of the Third Circle to halt, and she obeyed. You are not a waitress anymore, Cylindra. You are coming with us." The journey to the Obsidian Spire was a blur of terrified exhaustion. Cylindra was not bound, nor was she gagged, but she was trapped just the same. She sat in the velvet-lined interior of a black carriage that had materialized from the mist, sitting opposite Veronet, who stared at her with a hatred so potent it felt like a physical burn. Isidore rode ahead on a nightmare, a horse made of shadow and smoke, while Kenrick drove the carriage. "Do not think you are special," Veronet hissed, her voice low so the men outside wouldn't hear. "He collects oddities. Once he realizes you are just a parrot mimicking sounds you don't understand, he will toss you to the hounds." "I didn't mean to," Cylindra whispered, clutching her meager belongings, a small sack with 2 tunics and a wooden comb. I don't know where the words came from. "Liar!" Veronet spat. "High umbral cannot be learned. It is inherited, and humans do not inherit the tongue of gods." The carriage jolted as they crossed the vale. Cylindra felt the shift in air pressure. The grey mist valley vanished, replaced by a landscape of stark, terrifying beauty. The sky was a bruised purple, lit by 2 pale moons. The trees were tall, black spikes that clawed at the heavens, and ahead, rising from the jagged cliffs, was the Obsidian Spire. It was a monstrosity of architecture, a castle defied gravity, consisting of floating towers tethered by massive iron chains. It was a fortress of eternal night. As the carriage clattered into the courtyard, the sensory overload was immense. The smell of jasmine and copper hung heavy in the air. Vampires of all ranks moved through the shadows, courtiers in silks, guards in bone armor. They stopped and stared as the Patriarch dismounted. Isidore opened the carriage door himself. He offered a hand to Cylindra. She hesitated. Taking his hand felt like signing a contract with the devil. But leaving it hanging seemed like a death sentence. She placed her rough, calloused hand in his cold, smooth one. "Welcome to your new home, Cylindra," Isidore said smoothly. "Do try not to die." He led her through the great hall. It was a cavernous space with a floor of polished black glass that reflected the ceiling, a living map of the stars. Dozens of vampires bowed low as Isidore passed, but their eyes snapped to Cylindra, hungry and curious. "Is this dinner, my lord?" a voice called out. A tall, gaunt vampire with hair like spider webs stepped forward. This was Jarvis Thornhill, the king's advisor, and a man who wore his ambition like a second skin. Isidore stopped. "Jarvis, this is Cylindra. She is a guest. A human guest," Jarvis sneered, stepping closer, invading Cylindra's personal space. He sniffed the air near her neck. "She smells of fear and cheap ale. Hardly a vintage suited for the Patriarch." Isidore's grip on Cylindra's hand tightened, not painfully, but possessively. "She speaks the old tongue, Jarvis." The sneer vanished from Jarvis's face, replaced by a mask of calculated shock. "Impossible. The line of the speakers ended with the Great Purge." "So we thought," Isidore murmured. "She stays in the East Wing, adjacent to my chambers." A ripple of shock went through the court. The East Wing was the Patriarch's private sanctum. No one, not even his consorts, slept there. "My lord," Veronet interjected, stepping up beside Jarvis. "Is that wise? She is a human. A spy, perhaps, or an assassin sent by the hunter guilds." "If she is an assassin," Isidore said dryly, "she is the most incompetent one I have ever met. She tripped over her own feet 3 times getting into the carriage." Cylindra flushed crimson, looking at her boots. "Take her," Isidore commanded Ursuline, an elderly vampiress who looked more like a kindly grandmother than a predator of the night. Ursuline bowed and gently took Cylindra's arm. "Come, child," Ursuline said, her voice raspy but warm. "Let's get you out of those rags." As Cylindra was led away, she glanced back. Isidore was watching her, his expression unreadable. But Jarvis and Veronet were watching Isidore, and in their eyes, Cylindra saw the promise of violence. The East Wing was a palace within a palace. Her room was larger than the entire tavern she had worked in. The bed was draped in silk, a fire roared in a marble hearth, and a balcony overlooked the abyss below the spire. Ursuline busied herself preparing a bath. "Don't mind, Veronet," the old vampiress said. "She wanted the ring, you see. She has been trying to court the Patriarch for 2 centuries. "The ring?" Cylindra asked, sinking onto the edge of the bed. "The ring of the matriarch," Ursuline explained. Isidore cannot marry just anyone. He needs a partner who can open the crypts of ancestry. Only someone who speaks the old tongue can do that. He has been alone for a millennium, waiting. Cylindra's blood ran cold. He wants me to open a crypt? He wants you to survive, child, Ursuline said, pouring scented oil into the steaming water. But in this court, being useful is the only way to keep your blood inside your veins. Wash. Rest. Tonight there is a banquet, and you are the main attraction. Cylindra did not sleep. The silence of the spire was heavy, filled with the whispers of the wind against the stone. She spent the hours scrubbing the tavern grime from her skin, scrubbing until she was raw, as if she could scrub away the memory of the poverty she came from. Ursuline returned with a dress. It was deep violet, matching Cylindra's eyes, made of a fabric that shimmered like moonlight on water. It was modest, with a high neck and long sleeves, but it fitted her form perfectly, revealing a grace she had always hidden under shapeless wool. "Head up," Ursuline chided, as she pinned Cylindra's hair up with silver combs. "If you look like a victim, they will treat you like one." The banquet hall was a sensory assault. Long tables groaned under the weight of exotic meats, rarely cooked, and decanters of thick, dark liquid that Cylindra prayed was wine. Music played, a haunting melody on string instruments made of bone. When Cylindra entered, flanked by Kenric, who acted as her unwilling bodyguard, the room fell silent again. Isidore sat at the head of the high table on a throne of twisted obsidian. He looked up, and for a second, his mask of indifference cracked. His eyes traced the line of her neck, the violet dress, the fear in her stance. He beckoned her with a single finger. Cylindra walked the gauntlet of eyes. She could hear their whispers, human, frail, temporary. She took the seat to his right, the seat of honor. "You clean up well, little mouse," Isidore murmured, leaning close. His scent was overwhelming, cloves, rain, and danger. "I feel like a doll in a glass case," Cylindra replied, surprised by her own boldness. Isidore chuckled, a low rumble. "A glass case keeps the dust off, and the claws out." "Why am I here, my lord?" "Truly?" she asked, keeping her voice low. Isidore swirled the red liquid in his goblet. "I am dying, Cylindra." She blinked, shocked. But you are immortal." "Immortality is just a very long decay," he said, his voice void of emotion. "My bloodline carries a curse, the silence. Every generation, our power fades. I am the last patriarch who remembers the true magic. When I fade, the Obsidian Spire falls, and the feral vampires, the ones without minds, the ones kept at bay by my will swarm the human lands. Your lands." He turned to her, his golden eyes intense. "To break the curse, I need to access the first library. It is sealed by a lock that responds only to the resonance of high umbral, spoken by a living soul. Not a vampire. A living soul. And if I open it, then I am healed. The spire stands. And you," he paused, "you will be rewarded beyond your wildest dreams. And if I fail, then we both die. Me slowly, you, likely very quickly, at the hands of Jarvis, who would rather see the kingdom burn than see me healed." The weight of it crushed her. She was a waitress. Her biggest problem yesterday was running out of turnips for the stew. Today, she was the key to preventing an apocalypse. "I don't know the words," she confessed. "They just happened." "We will find them," Isidore said. "Tonight, after this farce of a dinner, meet me in the archives." The dinner was an ordeal. Veronet spent the entire meal sharpening a silver knife on a whetstone, staring at Cylindra. Jarvis asked polite, venomous questions about Cylindra's village, implying he might visit it for a snack. Isidore deflected them all with sharp wit and subtle threats, playing the role of the bored monarch perfectly. But Cylindra saw the tremor in his hand when he set down his glass. He was weaker than he looked. Later in the archives, a cathedral of books that smelled of ancient dust, Isidore paced. "The lock is metaphysical," he explained, pointing to a massive door made of solid white marble, veins of gold pulsing within it. "It requires a phrase, a specific emotional resonance." Cylindra approached the door. She felt a hum, a vibration that started in her teeth and moved to her heart. It felt familiar. It felt like the lullaby. "Who taught you the sounds?" Isidore asked, standing behind her, close enough that his cold breath stirred the hair on her neck. "My grandmother," Cylindra said softly. "She was strange. She claimed we were descended from the stars." "Not stars," Isidore whispered. "Servants, the first humans who pledged loyalty to the first king. They were bonded by blood and word." He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. "Try. Just speak what the door makes you feel." Cylindra closed her eyes. She placed her palm on the cold marble. She felt sorrow. Immense, crushing sorrow. A longing for a sun that never rose. The words bubbled up, unbidden. "Ethelgard, Morithun, Sanguis, Amare." The gold veins in the marble flared with blinding light. The door groaned, the sound of grinding stone echoing through the library. It cracked open just an inch. Isidore exhaled, a sound of pure relief. "You did it." But before they could celebrate, a shadow detached itself from the bookshelves. "So it is true," Jarvis's voice dripped from the darkness. He stepped into the light, holding a crossbow loaded with a bolt of white ash wood, lethal to vampires. But he wasn't aiming at Isidore. He was aiming at Cylindra. "The curse ends tonight, Patriarch," Jarvis smiled. "But not the way you want. If the girl dies, the door stays shut, and the throne becomes mine by default when you rot." Isidore moved. He was fast, but he was weakened by the curse. He threw himself in front of Cylindra just as the crossbow twanged. The bolt struck Isidore in the shoulder. He roared, a sound of fury and pain, and fell to one knee. "Run!" Isidore snarled at Cylindra, his eyes flashing feral gold. But Cylindra didn't run. She looked at the bleeding king, then at the arrogant advisor. Something inside her snapped. The shy waitress died in that moment. She stood tall, her violet eyes glowing with a faint, inner light. She pointed a trembling finger at Jarvis and screamed a word she had never heard before, a word that tasted like ash and thunder. "Kneel!" The command, spoken in high umbral, hit Jarvis like a physical blow. His knees buckled. He slammed into the stone floor, the crossbow clattering away. He gasped, clawing at his throat, unable to breathe, unable to disobey. Isidore looked up at her, blood seeping through his fingers, awe and terror warring on his face. Cylindra stood panting, the magic fading, leaving her exhausted. She had silenced the court, and now she had brought a high lord to his knees. The game had changed. The mouse had teeth. The silence that followed Cylindra's command was heavier than the stone door of the archives. It was a physical weight, pressing against the lungs of everyone in the room. Jarvis Thornhill, the arrogant architect of the court's misery, remained on his knees. His face purpled with the strain of fighting a compulsion that was woven into his very marrow. He clawed at the floor, his nails scraping against the stone, but he could not rise. He was a puppet, and Cylindra held the strings. "Kenrick!" Isidore's voice broke the trance. It was a wet, ragged sound, The massive bodyguard materialized from the shadows of the doorway, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. The kneeling advisor, the glowing human girl, and his king bleeding out on the floor. "Secure him," Isidore wheezed, clutching his shoulder where the white ash bolt was buried deep. Smoke curled from the wound, smelling of burning meat and ozone. The dungeons, the deepest cell, and gag him. If he speaks a spell... Kenrick didn't hesitate. He seized Jarvis by the scruff of his silk collar and dragged him out. Jarvis's eyes remained locked on Cylindra, wide with a terror that transcended the fear of death. It was the fear of a god returned. Once they were gone, the adrenaline abandoned Cylindra. Her knees gave way, and she slumped to the floor, the strange violet light in her eyes fading to dull exhaustion. Cylindra. Isidore tried to reach for her, but the movement made him hiss in pain. The ashwood was poison to his kind, a necrotic blight that stopped their supernatural healing. "I'm here," she whispered, crawling over to him. Up close, the damage was terrifying. The bolt had pinned his coat to his flesh, and the veins around the wound were turning a necrotic black. "You have to pull it out," Isidore said, his teeth gritted, sweat beading on his pale forehead. "I cannot touch the wood. It burns." Cylindra stared at the bolt. Her hands, which had only ever held tankards and brooms, were shaking. I can't. I might kill you." "I am already dying," Isidore gasped, his golden eyes locking onto hers. They were losing their light, the slit pupils dilating. "Trust your hands. They hold power now." She took a breath that shuddered in her chest. She placed one hand on his chest to steady him. His skin was freezing, hard as marble, and wrapped her fingers around the shaft of the bolt. The wood felt warm, buzzing with a hateful energy. "On 3, she whispered. 1, 2. She pulled on 2. Isidore screamed, a raw, primal sound that echoed through the vast library. Black blood, thick as tar, welled up and spilled over her hands. She tossed the bolt aside. It sizzled as it hit the stone floor. Isidore collapsed back, panting, his chest heaving. "Sneaky. Little mouse. I learned that from pulling stubborn roots in the garden," she said, her voice trembling as she pressed her apron against the wound to staunch the flow. "If you wait for 3, the anticipation makes it worse." He looked at her, really looked at her, through a haze of pain. "You commanded him. You used the voice." "I didn't mean to," she said quickly, terrified he would see her as a threat. "I was just angry. He hurt you." Isidore's hand covered hers, pressing it firmer against his wound. His blood stained her skin, creating a bond of crimson. "You saved me. For the second time tonight." "Isidore," she said, using his name for the first time without a title. "Why does the language listen to me?" "Because," he murmured, his eyes fluttering shut as unconsciousness threatened to claim him. "The language is not magic, Cylindra. It is memory. And your blood remembers what the world has forgotten." He passed out then, leaving Cylindra alone in the vast, dark library of a vampire king, her hands covered in his blood, with the realization that she was no longer just a guest. She was his lifeline. The days that followed were a blur of hushed whispers and medicinal poultices. Isidore was confined to his chambers, fighting the infection the ash had left behind. The court was in turmoil. Jarvis's imprisonment had sent shock waves through the nobility. Factions were forming, those loyal to the Patriarch, and those who whispered that a king who needed a human to fight his battles was no king at all. Cylindra found herself the center of this storm. She was moved from the guest room to the antechamber of Isidore's suite, ostensibly to be his nurse, but in reality, to keep her alive. Kenrick stood guard outside the door like a stone gargoyle, allowing no one in but Ursuline. It was on the 4th night that Isidore summoned her. He was sitting up in bed, propped against velvet pillows. The black veins had receded, leaving behind a nasty, star-shaped scar on his shoulder. He looked thinner, his cheekbones sharper, but the golden fire was back in his eyes. "We cannot delay," he said, his voice raspy but firm. "Jarvis has allies. If we do not open the inner sanctum of the library and break the curse, they will storm these doors before the next moon." "You can barely walk," Cylindra argued, placing a tray of broth on the bedside table. "Then you will be my crutch," he said, throwing back the covers. He was wearing loose silk trousers, his chest bare and bandaged. Cylindra averted her eyes, feeling a heat rise in her cheeks that had nothing to do with the fireplace. Supported by her shoulder, Isidore led her back to the archives. The massive marble door stood slightly ajar, just as they had left it. "Inside," Isidore whispered, "lies the history of the First Court and the source of the curse." They pushed the door open together. The room beyond was not a library in the traditional sense. It was a void, a pocket of space where floating crystals held swirling nebulas of light. Each crystal was a book, a memory stored in light. "This is the sanctum," Isidore said, awe softening his features. "I have not been here since I was a fledgling, before the door sealed itself." He guided her toward a central pedestal where a single, massive black diamond hovered. "This is the heart. It holds the contract between the first king and the first human." "The contract," Cylindra reached out, drawn to the stone. "Touch it," Isidore commanded softly. "Let it read you." As her fingertips grazed the cold surface of the diamond, the room exploded into light. Cylindra was no longer standing in the spire. She was standing in a sunlit meadow thousands of years ago. A man stood before her, tall, with Isidore's face, but warmer eyes, and a woman stood beside him, small, with hair like wet straw and violet eyes. They were holding hands. "I bind my blood to yours," the woman said, her voice echoing with the power of the high umbral. "My voice shall be your anchor. Your strength shall be my shield. As long as my line endures, your sanity shall hold." The vision shifted. She saw betrayal, a later generation of vampires, arrogant and hungry, hunting the woman's descendants. She saw the pact broken. She saw the vampires losing their minds, becoming feral beasts, the silence creeping in as the anchor was severed. Cylindra gasped, pulling her hand back. The vision shattered, returning them to the dark library. She stumbled back into Isidore's arms. "You saw her," Isidore whispered, holding her steady. "The first matriarch. She was human." "She was my ancestor," Cylindra realized, the truth settling in her gut like a heavy stone. "That's why I can speak it. The pact wasn't just words. It was genetic. You didn't enslave us. We saved you." "We were partners," Isidore corrected, his expression pained. "My kind forgot that. We grew arrogant. We thought we were gods and treated humans as cattle. We broke the bond, and in doing so, we doomed ourselves to madness." He looked down at her, and the intensity of his gaze made her breath hitch. "You are not just a key, Cylindra. You are the other half of the crown. Without you, I am just a monster waiting to go mad." The air between them changed. It was no longer the tension of survival. It was the tension of recognition. Two souls, separated by a millennium of blood and war, finding their rhythm again. Isidore raised a hand, tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that terrified her more than his anger ever could. "I have spent centuries looking for a spell to fix me. I never realized I was looking for a person. Cylindra leaned into his touch, her heart hammering against her ribs. What happens now? Now, Isidore said, his thumb brushing her lower lip. We renew the pact, but not as master and servant, as equals. He leaned down, and for a moment she thought he would kiss her. Her eyes fluttered shut, her body leaning toward him, but the moment was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. The sound came from the main entrance of the archives. Isidore spun around, positioning himself between Cylindra and the door, his weakness forgotten, replaced by lethal grace. Veronet stood there, but she was not alone. Behind her were a dozen guards, their armor bearing the sigil of the Thornhill family, a rose wrapped in barbed wire. How touching, Veronet drawled, stepping over the shattered remains of a memory crystal. The monster finds his pet. It's almost poetic. Shame it has to end in a massacre. Veronet, Isidore warned, his voice low and dangerous. Step aside, and I might let you keep your head. Your threats are empty, old king, she spat. We know you are wounded. We know the ash wood is still in your blood. And we know that she pointed a manicured nail at Cylindra, is the only thing holding you together. She snapped her fingers. Kill the girl. Leave the king for Jarvis. The guards surged forward. Stay behind me, Isidore roared. He unleashed a wave of telekinetic force, blasting the first 3 guards backward into the shelves. But he staggered, his face going grey. Using magic while wounded was draining his life force rapidly. Cylindra saw it. She saw the tremor in his legs. She saw the desperation. He can't fight them all, she realized. Not like this. She looked at the black diamond on the pedestal. The heart. The contract. My voice shall be your anchor. She didn't run behind him. She ran to the pedestal. Cylindra, no! Isidore shouted, parrying a sword strike with his bare forearm, his skin turning to steel. Cylindra grabbed the diamond with both hands. It was freezing cold, burning her palms. She didn't try to control the guards. She didn't try to fight. She poured everything she had, her fear, her love, her heritage, into the stone. Sanguis, vincit, mortem. Blood conquers death. She screamed the words, not at the room, but into Isidore. The effect was instantaneous. Isidore arched his back as a beam of violet light shot from the diamond, striking him in the chest. It didn't hurt him. It filled him. The grey pallor vanished from his skin. The wound on his shoulder knitted together before their eyes. His muscles swelled, ripping the bandages. He grew, his shadow lengthening, darkening, becoming a physical entity that detached from the floor and wrapped around him like armor. He turned to the guards, and his eyes were no longer gold. They were of violet, so deep they looked black, mirroring Cylindra's own. He didn't move fast. He moved instantly. One moment he was by the pedestal, the next he was in the center of the guards. There was no fight. It was a slaughter. He moved like liquid smoke, tearing through armor and bone with terrifying ease. Veronet screamed, turning to flee, but the shadow Isidore was there. He caught her by the throat, lifting her feet off the ground. You wanted a monster, Isidore said, his voice overlapping with a darker, ancient tone. The voice of the first king. Here I am. He threw her across the room. She hit the wall with a sickening crunch and slid down, unconscious. Silence returned to the library, but it was different this time. It was the silence of a hurricane's eye. Isidore stood amidst the carnage, his chest heaving. The violet light in his eyes faded, returning to gold, but he looked wild, feral. He turned slowly toward Cylindra. For a heartbeat, she was terrified. Had she healed him, or had she unleashed the beast? He took a step toward her, then another. He fell to his knees, not from weakness, but in supplication. He took her hands, which were still smoking slightly from the energy of the stone, and pressed his forehead against them. "You gave me your strength," he whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. "You bound your life force to mine to save me. I told you," she said softly, stroking his hair, her fingers trembling. "I'm not just a waitress." "No." He looked up, and the raw vulnerability in his face stole her breath. "You are my queen." But the victory was short-lived. From the open doorway, a slow, sarcastic clapping echoed. Jarvis Thornhill stood there. He was bruised, his clothes torn, but he was free, and he was holding something that made Cylindra's blood freeze. It was a jagged shard of black glass, a piece of the Obsidian Spire's foundation stone. "Bravo," Jarvis sneered. "A beautiful performance. The pact is renewed. The king is healed. But you forgot one thing, my lord." He held up the shard. It pulsed with a sick green light. "While you were playing house in the library, I had my engineers rig the foundation chains. The spire is not just a castle. It is a cage for the beast below. And I just unlocked the door." A deep, subterranean rumble shook the floor. Dust rained from the ceiling. The floating towers outside the window lurched, dipping dangerously. "You're mad," Isidore breathed, standing up, shielding Cylindra. "If the spire falls, the beast wakes. It will consume us all." "It will consume you," Jarvis smiled, backing into the shadows. "I have made a deal with it. Chaos is a ladder, Isidore, and I am climbing." He crushed the shard in his hand. The floor beneath them cracked. The entire eastern wing of the library sheared off, tilting into the abyss. Cylindra screamed as she lost her footing, sliding toward the infinite drop of the night sky below. "Cylindra!" Isidore dove, his hand outstretched. Their fingers brushed, skin against skin, hope against gravity. But the stone crumbled. Cylindra fell into the darkness, the wind tearing the scream from her throat, watching Isidore's horrified face recede into the distance as the obsidian spire began to crumble around him. She fell into the mist, into the waiting arms of the world below, where the monsters that even vampires feared lay sleeping. The fall felt eternal. It was a descent through layers of cold mist, silence, and the crushing weight of despair. Cylindra did not scream. The air had been stolen from her lungs moments after the stone crumbled. She simply fell, watching the faint violet light of the spire fade into a star. Then nothing. She expected death to be a hard impact, a sudden cessation of being. Instead, she was caught. Not by hands, but by the air itself. The atmosphere of the deep below was thick, viscous, almost like water. She slowed, drifting down through canopies of gargantuan, bioluminescent fungi that glowed with a ghostly teal pulse. She landed softly on a bed of moss that smelled of damp earth and ozone, the impact jarring but not fatal. Cylindra gasped, air rushing back into her starved lungs. She rolled over, coughing, her violet dress torn and stained with the black dust of the spire. She was alive. "Isidore!" she screamed, her voice sounding small and fragile in the immense cavern. The only answer was the chittering of unseen things in the shadows. The deep below was not empty. It was a graveyard of the world before, a subterranean jungle where the sun had never touched. Something moved in the periphery of her vision. A shadow, larger than a carriage, detached itself from the gloom. It had 6 legs and eyes that burned like dying stars. It was a crystalline arachnid, a scavenger of the deep, and it hissed, mandibles clicking with the sound of grinding glass. Cylindra scrambled backward, her hand finding a jagged rock. "Stay back!" The creature lunged. Instinct took over. Not the instinct to fight, but the instinct to command. The blood of the first matriarch surged in her veins, hotter than before. tempered by the terror of the fall. "Sister!" "Stop!" The word slammed into the creature. It froze mid-air, crashing to the ground a few feet from her. But it wasn't just stopped, it was pacified. Its burning eyes dimmed to a soft blue. It lowered its head, making a sound that was almost a purr. Cylindra stood slowly, her legs shaking. She walked toward the monster, her hand outstretched. She touched its cold, chitinous carapace. "You aren't a monster," she whispered, realizing the truth that Isidore's ancestors had forgotten. "You are a guardian. You are waiting for orders." The creature chittered softly. It nudged her hand. "The silence," she murmured, looking around at the dark, pulsating jungle. The vampires went mad because they lost the connection to this, to the earth, to the deep magic. She wasn't just a key to a door in a tower. She was the bridge between the sky and the roots. A tremor shook the ground. Far above, a boom echoed like thunder. The spire was collapsing. Debris rained down, chunks of obsidian the size of houses crashing into the distance. Isidore was up there, dying. Cylindra looked at the arachnid. "Can you climb?" The creature clicked its mandibles. "Take me up," she commanded, climbing onto its back, gripping the crystalline spines. "Take me to the king." As she rode the beast up the sheer cliffs of the abyss, leading a growing swarm of deep creatures drawn to her light, Cylindra realized she was done being the shy waitress. She was bringing the army of the underworld to save the Lord of the Sky. The obsidian spire was screaming. The metal groaned, the stone wept dust, and the magical chains that held it aloft were snapping, one by one, with the sound of cannon fire. Isidore stood on the edge of the shattered archive, his coat tattered, his chest heaving. He was holding the castle together with his mind. Every muscle in his body was locked rigid, veins bulging in his neck as he poured his remaining life force into the telekinetic web, keeping the spire from plummeting into the dark. "My lord!" Kenric roared, cleaving a rebel guard in two with his great sword. "You must let it go. The structure is failing. We need to evacuate to the gliders." "I am not leaving her," Isidore snarled, blood trickling from his nose. "She fell. If the spire crashes, it will crush the valley below. I have to hold it." "She is gone, Isidore," Jarvis Thornhill shouted from across the chasm. The traitor advisor was floating on a disk of dark magic, surrounded by his elite soldiers. "The girl is paced on the valley floor. Accept it. Surrender the crown, and I will let you live long enough to watch me rule." Isidore looked at Jarvis, his golden eyes burning with a hatred so pure it felt like a star going supernova. "You broke the world, Jarvis, because you wanted a bigger chair." "I broke the shackles," Jarvis laughed, "and now I will summon the beast to finish you." Jarvis raised the shard of the foundation stone. He began to chant, a twisted, discordant version of the old tongue. He wasn't trying to heal, he was trying to corrupt. Below them, from the abyss, a roar answered. But it wasn't the roar of a mindless beast, it was a chorus. Isidore felt it first, a vibration in his blood, a resonance. Him. He looked down into the darkness. A blue light was rising, fast. "Kenric," Isidore whispered, the strain on his face relaxing into a look of disbelief. "Do you hear that?" "Hear what, my lord?" "The lullaby." The blue light erupted over the edge of the cliff. It wasn't one creature, it was hundreds. Massive crystalline spiders, beetles with shells of iron, winged serpents of bioluminescent vapor. They swarmed up the side of the falling spire, catching the falling debris, weaving webs of light to stabilize the crumbling towers. And riding the lead arachnid, standing tall with wind-whipped hair and eyes glowing violet, was Cylindra. "Jarvis," she screamed, her voice amplified by the acoustics of the deep. Your audience is over." Isidore fell to his knees, tears carving tracks through the dust on his face. "Impossible." Cylindra leapt from the spider onto the shattered platform of the archive. She didn't run to Isidore this time. She ran to the edge, facing Jarvis. "You wanted the beast?" Cylindra raised her hands. The deep creatures hissed, turning their gaze toward the floating traitor. "I brought the whole pack." Jarvis's face went pale. "No. The deep ones obey only the matriarch," Cylindra finished. She looked back at Isidore. He was broken, bleeding, and looking at her with a devotion that transcended crowns and kingdoms. "Let it fall, Isidore," she said softly. "What?" "The spire, the floating castle. It's a symbol of separation. Let it fall. We will catch it." Isidore looked at her, then at the army of creatures supporting the foundations. He understood. The era of the Sky Lords was over. The era of the Earth Kings had begun. He released his hold. The spire groaned, tipping forward. But it didn't crash. The webs of the deep creatures held it, lowering it gently, agonizingly slowly, towards the valley floor below. "No!" Jarvis shrieked. "Destroy them! Kill the witch!" He launched a bolt of dark magic at Cylindra. Isidore moved. He didn't use magic. He used his body, tackling Cylindra out of the way. The bolt struck the crystalline spider she had ridden, shattering it into dust. They rolled together across the stone, tangling in a heap of limbs. "You're alive," Isidore breathed, cupping her face, ignoring the chaos around them. "I told you." She smiled, tears in her eyes. "I'm not easy to get rid of." "The fall was a shortcut," she quipped. "Now, are we going to save your kingdom, or are you just going to stare at me?" "I could stare at you for a century," he admitted. "But killing Jarvis sounds appealing right now." The descent of the Obsidian Spire was the most terrifying spectacle the grey mist valley had ever seen. It didn't fall like a stone. It descended like a landing god, carried by a cloud of glowing monsters and the will of two lovers. When the massive structure finally touched the earth, the ground shook for miles. The floating towers settled into the valley floor, crushing the dead forests, rooting themselves in the soil for the first time in 3,000 years. The impact threw everyone to the ground. When the dust settled, the spire was no longer an inaccessible fortress in the sky. It was a fortress on the ground, its gates open to the mist. Jarvis had survived the landing. He stood in the courtyard, surrounded by the remnants of his loyalists. But he was cornered. On one side, Kenrick and the loyal guards. On the other, the deep creatures, chittering and clicking. And in the center, walking hand in hand, were Isidore and Cylindra. "It's over, Jarvis," Isidore said. His voice was calm, the voice of a king who no longer feared the silence. "The curse is broken. The connection is restored." "I am the future!" Jarvis screamed, his eyes bleeding black ichor. He had consumed too much dark magic in the descent. He was mutating, his skin stretching, bones cracking. "I am the evolution!" He lunged, transforming into a twisted, bat-like monstrosity, a feral vampire magnified by forbidden sorcery. He was fast, faster than Isidore in his weakened state. Isidore drew his sword, but Cylindra stepped forward. "Isidore," she said, her voice calm. "Together." He understood. He stepped behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, placing his hands over hers. He rested his chin on her shoulder. "Lead," he whispered against her ear. "I will follow." Cylindra closed her eyes. She didn't feel fear. She felt the hum of the earth beneath her boots. She felt the cold, dead magic of the vampires and the warm, vibrant magic of the humans. She wove them together. Lux, Eterna, Sanguise, Una, light eternal, blood as one. It wasn't a command of domination. It was a command of unification. Isidore poured his shadow magic into her. Cylindra poured her light voice into him. A shockwave of pure, white gold energy erupted from them. It swept across the courtyard. When it hit the loyal guards, they gasped, feeling their strength return, the hunger fading to a manageable dull ache. When it hit the deep creatures, they glowed brighter, chittering in joy. When it hit Jarvis, he screamed. The light was antithesis to his corruption. It didn't burn him, it unraveled him. The dark magic that held his mutated form together dissolved. He shrieked as he was stripped of his power, his stolen strength, his ambition. In seconds, there was nothing left of Jarvis Thornhill but a pile of ash and a hollow silk suit drifting in the wind. The silence that followed was absolute. The sun began to crest over the mountains. For the first time in millennia, the vampires didn't flee from it. The curse of the sun, linked to their madness, had weakened. They shielded their eyes, squinting, but they didn't burn. Isidore looked at the sunrise, then down at Cylindra. The golden light hit her face, illuminating the grime, the tears, and the fierce, undeniable beauty of her spirit. "You did it," he whispered. "You saved us." "We saved us," she corrected, turning in his arms to face him. The court watched, vampires, humans, and monsters alike, as the Vampire King, the terrifying Patriarch of the night, lowered his head and kissed the waitress from the rusty flagon. It was a kiss that tasted of dust, victory, and a promise kept. It was soft at first, a question asked, and then deep, desperate and consuming, an answer given. "Stay," Isidore murmured against her lips. "Rule with me. Not as a guest, not as a key." "As what?" she asked, breathless. "As my heart," he said, "and as the queen of the earth and sky." Cylindra looked past him, at the spire now rooted in the land, at the humans from the village cautiously approaching the gates, at the vampires lowering their weapons. "Okay," she whispered, "but the tavern stays open, and the ale needs to be better." Isidore laughed, a sound of pure, unburdened joy that rang out across the valley, signaling the end of the long night. The Obsidian Spire never floated again. It became the capital of a new kingdom, a city where the night and day coexisted. The grey mist valley bloomed with flowers that glowed in the dark, tended by the deep creatures. Cylindra and Isidore ruled not with fear, but with the balance of the pact, blood and voice, shadow and light. They say if you visit the Spire today, you can still see them. The tall, golden-eyed king and the woman with violet eyes, walking the battlements, hand in hand, guardians of a peace won by a spilled tray of wine and a love that defied gravity. Did this story capture your heart? If you enjoyed Cylindra and Isidore's journey from the tavern to the throne, please like this story and share it with your fellow romantics. Don't forget to subscribe for more tales of forbidden love, epic magic, and destiny. Let me know in the comments. Would you have jumped into the abyss for love?